Hello, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to the live stream. Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Part 2, Chapter 5, as well as Chapter 6. Chapter 5, How to Interest People. Everyone who was ever a guest of Theodore Roosevelt was astonished at the range and diversity of his knowledge. Whether his visitor was a cowboy or a rough rider, a New York politician or a diplomat, Roosevelt knew what to say. And how was it done? The answer was simple. When Roosevelt expected a visitor, he sat up late the night before reading up on the subject in which he knew his guest was particularly interested. For Roosevelt knew, as all leaders know, that the royal road to the person's heart is to talk about the things he or she treasures most. The genial William Leon Phelps, essayist and professor of literature at Yale, learned his lesson early in life. When I was 8 years old and I was spending a weekend visiting my Aunt Libby Lindsley at her home in Stratford on the Housatonic, he wrote in his essay on human nature, "A middle-aged man called one evening, and after a polite skirmish with my aunt, he devoted his attention to me. At that time, I happened to be excited about boats, and the visitor discussed the subject in a way that seemed to be particularly interesting. After he left, I spoke of him with enthusiasm. What a man! My aunt informed me that he was a New York lawyer, that he cared nothing whatever about boats, that he took not the slightest interest in the subject. But why then did he talk all the time about boats? Because he is a gentleman. He saw that you were interested in boats, and he talked about the things he knew would interest and please him. He made himself agreeable." And William Leon Phelps, William Leon Phelps added, "I never forgot my aunt's remark." As I write in this chapter, I have before me a letter from Edward L. Challiff, who was active in Boy Scout work. "One day I found I needed a favor," wrote Mr. Challiff. "A big Scout jamboree was coming off in Europe, and I wanted the president of one of the largest corporations in America to pay the expenses of one of my boys for the trip. Fortunately, just before I went to see this man, I heard that he had drawn a check for $1 million, and that after it was cancelled, he had it framed. So the first thing I did when I entered his office was to ask to see the check. A check for $1 million, I told him. I never knew that anybody had ever written such a check, and that I wanted to tell my boys that I'd actually seen a check for $1 million. He gladly showed it to me. I admired it and asked him to tell me about how it happened to be drawn. You notice, don't you, that Mr. Challiff didn't begin talking about Boy Scouts or the Jamboree in Europe or what it was he wanted. He talked in terms of what interested the other man. Here's the result. Presently, the man I said interviewing said, 'Oh, by the way, was it you wanted to see me about?' So I told him. To my vast surprise," Mr. Challiff continues, "he not only granted immediately what I asked for, but much more. I asked him to send only one boy to Europe, but he sent 5 boys and myself, gave me a letter of credit for $1,000 and told us to stay in Europe for 7 weeks. He also gave me letters of introduction to his branch presidents, putting them at our service, and he himself met us in Paris and showed us the town. Since then, he has given jobs to some of the boys whose parents were in want, and he is still active in our group. Yet I know if I hadn't found out what he was interested in and got him warmed up at first, I shouldn't have found him 1/10 as easy to approach." Is this a valuable technique to use in business, is it? Let's see. Take Henry G. Duvernoy of Duvernoy and Sons, a wholesale baking firm in New York. Mr. Duvernoy had been trying to sell bread to a certain New York hotel. He had called on the manager every week for 4 years. He went to the same social affairs that the manager attended. He even took rooms in the hotel, and I lived there in order to get the business. But he failed. Then, said Mr. Duvernoy, after studying human relations, I resolved to change my tactics. I decided to find out what interested this man. That caught his enthusiasm. What caught his enthusiasm? I discovered he belonged to a society of hotel executives called the Hotel Greeters of America. He not only belonged, but his bubbling enthusiasm made him president of the organization. and president of the International Greeters. No matter where its conventions were held, he would be there. So when I saw him the next day, I began talking about the greeters. What a response I got. What a response. He talked to me for half an hour about the greeters, his tones vibrant with enthusiasm. I could plainly see the society was not only his hobby, it was a passion of his life. Before I left his office, he had sold me a membership in his organization. In the meantime, I said nothing about bread, but a few days later, the steward of his hotel phoned me to come over with samples and prices. I don't know what you did to the old boy, the steward greeted me, but he sure is sold on you. Think of it. I had been drumming at that man for 4 years trying to get his business, and I'd still be drumming at him if I had finally taken the trouble to find out what interested him and what he enjoyed talking about. Edward E. Harriman of Hagerstown, Maryland, chose to live a beautiful Cumberland Valley of Maryland. After he completed his military service, unfortunately, at that time there were few jobs available in the area. A little research uncovered the fact that a number of companies in the area either owned or controlled an unusual business maverick, R.J. Funkhauser, whose rise from poverty to riches intrigued Mr. Harriman. However, he was known for being inaccessible to job seekers, Mr. Harriman wrote. I interviewed a number of people and found that his major interest was anchored in his drive for power and money. Since he protected himself from the people like me and used a dedicated and stern secretary, I studied her interests and goals, and only then I paid an unannounced visit to her at her office. She had been Mr. Funkhauser's orbiting satellite for about 15 years. When I told her I had a proposition for him which might translate itself into financial and political success for him, she became enthused. I also conversed with her about her constructive participation in this success. After his conversation, she arranged for me to meet Mr. Funkhauser. I entered his huge, impressive office, determined not to ask directly for a job. He was seated behind a large carved desk and thundered at me. How about it, young man? I said, Mr. Funkhauser. I believe I can make money for you. He immediately rose and invited to sit in one of the large upholstered chairs, enumerated my ideas and qualifications. He had to realize these ideas as well as how they contribute to his personal success and that of his businesses. RJ, as he became known to me, hired me at once, and for over 20 years I have grown in his enterprises and we have both prospered. Talking in terms of the other person's interests pay off for both parties. Howard Z. Herzig, a leader in the field of employee and communications, has always followed this principle. When asked what reward he got from it, Mr. Herzig responded that he not only received a different reward from each person, but that in general the reward had been an enlargement of his life each time he spoke to someone. Principle 5. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. Well, for the discussion, I'd have to agree. If you talk to the other person's interests, they have a lot more to say, which means you have a lot more questions to ask to tickle their intrigue and they continue the conversation. Personally, this has worked for me when I talk to people probably my age or younger, because I know that, for example, people younger than me, they're all about, films and pop culture and movies and movies, pop culture, music, television shows, Netflix, streaming services, apps, programs, using computers and tech. Some are interested in politics. A lot of them are interested in politics, actually, especially when it comes to, social justice and all of that. As far as Principle 5 is concerned, blah, 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 blah. Principle 5, talk in terms of the other person's interest. And for that, I would agree. And with that, we're moving on to Chapter 6. This one is not so long either. So that's why this video is a two-parter and the same amount of length. So you can watch that there. You can watch it here. Blah, 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 blah. Keep the thing in there. Making mistakes in the video, that's okay, because no one's watching the live and probably no one's going to watch the video anyway. So, oh well. Chapter 6, how to make people like you instantly. This is something I could use. And my hair is messy. I was waiting in line to register a letter in the post office at 33rd Street and 8th Avenue in New York. I noticed that the clerk appeared to be bored with the job, weighing envelopes, handing out stamps, making change, issuing receipts, the same monotonous grind year after year. As I said to myself, I'm going to try and make that clerk like me. Obviously, to make him like me, I must say something nice, not about myself, but about him. So I asked myself, what is there about him? What can I honestly admire? That is sometimes a hard question to answer, especially with strangers. But in this case, it happened to be easy. I instantly saw something I admired to no end. I admired no end. So while he was weighing my envelope, I remarked with enthusiasm, I certainly wish I had your head of hair. He looked up, half startled, his face beaming with smiles. Well, it isn't as good as it used to be, he said modestly. I assured him that although it might have lost some of its pristine glory, nevertheless it was still magnificent. He was immensely pleased. We carried on a pleasant little conversation. The last thing he said to me was, many people have admired my hair. I'll bet that person went out to lunch today walking on air. I'll bet he went home that night and told his wife about it. I bet he looked in the mirror and said, it's a beautiful head of hair. After this story once in public, and a man asked me afterwards, what did you do? What did you want to get out of him? Whatever I was trying to get out of him. What was I trying to get out of him? What was I trying to get out of him? What was I trying to get out of him? If we are so contemptibly selfish that we can't radiate a little happiness and pass on a bit of honest appreciation without trying to get something out of the other person in return, if our souls are no bigger than our sour crab apples, we shall meet with failure we so richly deserve. Oh yes, I did want something out of that chap. I wanted something priceless. And I got it. I got a feeling that I had done something for him without his being able to do anything whatever in return for me. That is feeling that flows and sings in your memory so long after the incident is past. There is one all-important law in human conduct. If we obey that law, we shall almost never get into trouble. In fact, that law, if obeyed, will bring us countless friends and constant happiness. In that very instant we break the law, we shall get into endless trouble. And the law is this: always make the other person feel important. John Dewey, as we have already noted, said that the desire to be important is the deepest urge in human nature, and William James said the deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. As I have already pointed out, it is this urge that differentiates us from animals. It is this urge that has been responsible for civilization itself. Philosophers have been speculating on the rules of human relationships for thousands of years, and out of all that speculation, there has evolved only one important precept. It is not new, it is as old as history. Zoroaster taught it to his followers in Persia 2,500 years ago. Confucius preached it in China 24 centuries ago. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, they're saying Taoism here. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, taught it to his disciples in the Valley of the Han. Buddha preached it on the bank of the holy Ganges 500 years before Christ. The sacred books of Hinduism taught it 1,000 years before that. Jesus taught it among the stony hills of Judea 19 centuries ago. Jesus summed it up in one thought: probably the most important rule in the world. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. You want the approval of those with whom you come into contact. You want recognition of your true worth. You want a feeling that you are important in your little world. You don't want to listen to the cheap and sincere flattery, but you do crave sincere appreciation. You want your friends and associates to be, as Charles Schwab put it, hearty in their approbation and lavish in their praise. All of us want that, and there's a phrase that comes back time and time again. So let's obey the golden rule and give unto others what we have others give unto us. How, when, where? The answer is all the time, everywhere. David G. Smith of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, told one of our classes how he handled a delicate situation when he asked to take charge of the refreshment, both at a charity concert. The night of the concert, I arrived at the park and found two elderly ladies in very bad humor standing the next refreshment stand. Apparently, each thought that she was in charge of this project. I stood there pondering what to do. One of the members of sponsoring committee appeared there, handed me a cash box, and thanked me for taking over the project. She introduced Rose and Jane as my helpers and then ran off. A great silence ensued. Pardon me. A great silence ensued. Realizing that the cash box was a symbol of authority of sorts, I gave the box to Rose and explained that I might not be able to keep the money straight and that if she took care of it, I would feel better. I then suggested to Jane that she showed two teenagers who had been assigned to refreshments how to operate the soda machine, and I asked her to be responsible for that part of the project. The evening was very enjoyable, with Rose happily counting the money, Jane supervising the teenagers, and me enjoying the concert. You don't have to wait until you are an ambassador to France or chairman of the clambake committee of your lodge before you use this philosophy of appreciation. You can work magic with it in almost every day. If, for example, the waitress brings us mashed potatoes, when we ordered French fried, let's say, I'm sorry to trouble you, but I prefer French fried. She'll probably reply, no trouble at all. And we will be glad to change the potatoes because we have shown respect for her. Little phrases such as, I'm sorry to trouble you, would you be so kind as to, won't you please, would you mind, thank you. Little courtesies like these oil the cogs of the monotonous grind of everyday life, and incidentally, they are the hallmark of good breeding. Let's take another illustration. Hall Caine's novels, The Christian, The Deemster, The Manx Man, among them, were all bestsellers in the early part of this century. Millions of people read his novels, countless millions. He was the son of a blacksmith. He never had more than 8 years schooling in his life, yet when he died, he was the richest literary man of his time. The story goes like this. Hall Caine loved sonnets and ballads, so he devoured all of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poetry. He even wrote a lecture chanting praises of Rossetti's artistic achievement and sent a copy of Rossetti to Rossetti himself. Rossetti was delighted. Any young man who has such exalted opinion of his ability, Rossetti probably said to himself, must be brilliant. So Rossetti invited himself to the blacksmith's son, come to London and act as his secretary. That was the turning point in Hall Caine's life, for in his new position he met the literary artists of his day. Profiting by their advice and inspired by their encouragement, he launched upon a career that emblazoned his name across the sky. His home, Greeba Castle, on the Isle of Man, became a mecca for tourists from the far corners of the world, and he left a multi-million-dollar estate. Yet who knows, he might have died poor and unknown had he not written an essay expressing his admiration for a famous man. Such is the power, the stupendous power of sincere, heartfelt appreciation. Rossetti considered himself important. That is not strange. Almost everyone considers himself important, very important. The life of a man could probably be changed if someone who would make feel important. Ronald J. Rowland, who was one of the instructors of our course in California, is also a teacher of arts and crafts. He wrote to us about a student named Chris in his beginning crafts class. Chris was a very quiet, shy boy, lacking in self-confidence, the kind of student that does not receive the attention he deserves. I also teach an advanced class that had grown to be somewhat of a status symbol and privilege for students to have to earn the right to be next to it. On Wednesday, Chris was diligently working at his desk. I felt there was a hidden fire deep inside him. I asked Chris if he would like to be in an advanced class. How I wish I could express the look on Chris's face, the emotions that shy 14-year-old boy trying to hold back his tears. Who, me, Mr. Rowland? Am I good enough? Yes, Chris, you are good enough. I had to leave at that point because tears were coming to my eyes. As Chris walked out of the class that day, seemingly 2 inches taller, he looked at me with bright blue eyes and said in a positive voice, "Thank you, Mr. Rowland." Chris taught me a lesson that I will never forget, our deep desire to feel important. To help me never to forget this rule, I made a sign which reads, "You are important." This sign hangs in the front of my classroom for all to see and to remind each student I face is equally important. That's nice. The unvarnished truth is that almost all people you meet feel themselves superior to you in some way. And a sure way to their hearts is to let them realize in some sort of way that you recognize their importance and recognize it sincerely. Remember what Emerson said, every man I meet is superior in some way, and that I learn of him. And that pathetic part of it, and the pathetic part of it is that frequently those who have the least justification for a feeling of achievement bolster up their egos by a show of tumult and conceit, which is truly nauseating. As Shakespeare put it, man, proud man, dressed in little brief authority, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven as make the angels weep. I am going to tell you how business people in my own course have applied these principles with remarkable results. Let's take the case of a Connecticut attorney. Because of his relatives, he prefers not to have his name mentioned. Shortly after joining the course, Mr. R drove to Long Island with his wife to visit some of her relatives. She left him to chat with an old aunt of hers and then rushed off by herself to visit some of the younger relatives. Since he had soon to give a speech professionally on how he applied the principles of appreciation, he thought he would gain some worthwhile experience. Talking with the elderly lady, so he walked around the house to see what he could honestly admire. This house was built in 1890, wasn't it? He inquired. Yes, she replied. That is precisely the year it was built. It reminds us of the house I was born in, he said. It's beautiful, well built, roomy. You know, they don't build houses like this anymore. You're right, the old lady agreed. The young folks nowadays don't care for beautiful homes. All they want is a small apartment, and then off they go getting about in their automobiles. This is a dream house, she said in a voice vibrating with tender memories. This house was built with love. My husband and I dreamed about it for years before we built it, and we didn't have an architect. We planned it all ourselves. She showed Mr. R about the house, and he expressed in his hearty admiration for the beautiful treasures he had picked up in her travels and cherished over a lifetime. Paisley, shawls, an old English tea set, Wedgwood china, French beds and chairs, Italian paintings, and silk draperies that had once hung in a French chateau. After showing Mr. R through the house, she took him out of the garage. There, jacked up on blocks, was a packed car in mint condition. My husband bought that car for me shortly before he passed on. She said softly, I have never ridden in it. Since his death, you appreciate nice things, and I'm going to give this car to you. Why, Auntie, he said, you overwhelm me. I appreciate your generosity, of course, but I couldn't possibly accept it. I'm not even a relative of yours. I have a new car, and you have many relatives that would like to have that Packard. Relatives, she exclaimed. Yes, I have relatives who are just waiting till I die so that they can get that car, but they are not going to get it. If you don't want to give it to them, you can very easily sell it to the second-hand dealer, he told her. Sell it? Sell it, she cried. Do you think I would sell this car? Do you think I would stand to see strangers riding up and down the street in that car that my husband bought for me? I wouldn't dream of selling it. I am going to give it to you. You appreciate beautiful things. He tried to get out of accepting the car, but he couldn't without hurting her feelings. This lady, left all alone in a big house with her Paisley shawls, her French antiques, and her memories, was starving for a little recognition. She had once been young and beautiful and sought after. She had once built a house warm with love and had collected things from all over Europe to make it beautiful. Now, in the isolated loneliness of old age, she craved a little human warmth, a little genuine appreciation, and no one gave it to her. And when she found out, like a spring in the desert, her gratitude couldn't adequately express itself with anything less than the gift of her cherished Packard. Let's take another case. Donald McMahon, who was superintendent of Lewis and Valentine, nurserymen, and landscape architects in Rye, New York, related this incident. Shortly after I attended the walk upon how to win friends and influence people, I was landscaping the estate for a famous attorney. The owner came out to give me a few instructions about where he wished to plant a mass of rhododendrons and azaleas. I said, Judge, you have a lovely hobby. I've been admiring your beautiful dogs. I understand you win a lot of blue ribbons every year at the show at Madison Square Garden. The effect of this little expression of appreciation was striking. Yes, the judge replied. I do have a lot of fun with my dogs. Would you like to see my kennel? He spent almost an hour showing me his dogs and the prizes they had won. He even brought out their pedigrees and explained about the bloodlines responsible for their beauty and intelligence. Finally, turning to me, he asked, "Do you have any small children?" "Yes, I do," I replied. "I have a son." "Well, wouldn't he like a puppy?" the judge inquired. "Oh, yes, he'll be tickled pink." "All right, I'm going to give him one," the judge announced. He started to tell me how to feed the puppy. Then he paused. "You'll forget it if I tell you. I'll write it out." So the judge went to his house, typed out the pedigree and feeding instructions, and gave me a puppy worth several $100s and 1 hour and 15 minutes of his valuable time, largely because I expressed my honest admiration for his hobby and achievements. George Eastman, of Kodak fame, invented the transparent film that made motion pictures possible and made himself one of the most famous businessmen on earth. Yet, in spite of all the tremendous accomplishments, he craved little recognition, even as you and I. He craved little recognitions, even as you and I. To illustrate, when Eastman was building Eastman School of Music and also Kilbourne Hall of Rochester, James Adamson, the president of the Superior Seating Company of New York, wanted to get the order to supply the theater chairs for these businesses. Phoning the architect, Mr. Adamson made an appointment to see Mr. Eastman in Rochester. When Adamson arrived, the architect said, "I know you want to get this order, but I can tell you right now that you won't stand a ghost of a show if it takes more than 5 minutes of George Eastman's time. He is a strict disciplinarian. He is very busy, so tell your stories quickly and get out." Adamson was prepared to do just that. When he was ushered into the room, he saw Mr. Eastman bending over a pile of papers at his desk. Presently, Mr. Eastman looked up, removed his glasses, and walked towards the architect and Mr. Adamson, saying, "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I do for you?" The architect introduced them, and then Mr. Adamson said, "While we've been waiting for you, Mr. Eastman, I've been admiring your office. I wouldn't mind working in a room like this myself. I'm in the interior woodworking business, and I never saw a more beautiful office in all of my life." George Eastman replied, "You remind me of something I'd almost forgotten." "It is beautiful, isn't it? I enjoyed it a great deal when it was first built. But I come down here now with a lot of things on my mind, and sometimes you don't even see the room for weeks at a time." Adamson walked over and rubbed his hands across the panel. "This is English oak, isn't it? A little different texture from Italian oak." "Yes," Eastman replied. "Important English oak. It was selected for me by a friend who specializes in fine woods." Eastman showed him about the room, commenting on proportions and coloring, the hand carving and other effects he had helped to plan and execute. While drifting about the room, admiring the woodwork, they paused before a window, and George Eastman, in his modest, soft-spoken way, pointed out some of the institutions through which he was trying to help humanity. The University of Rochester, the General Hospital, the Homeopathic Hospital, the Friendly Home of Children's Hospital, the Friendly Home, the Children's Hospital. Mr. Adamson congratulated him warmly on the idealistic way he was using this wealth to alleviate the sufferings of humanity. Presently, George Eastman unlocked a glass case and pulled out the first camera he had ever owned, an invention he had bought from an Englishman. Adamson questioned him at length about his struggles to get in the business, and Mr. Eastman spoke with real feeling about the poverty of his childhood, telling how his widowed mother had kept boarding house while he clerked in an insurance office. The terror of poverty haunted him that day and night, and he resolved to make enough money so that his mother wouldn't have to work. Mr. Addison drew him out of further questions and listened absorbed while he related to the story of his experiments with dry photographic plates. He told how he worked in an office all day and sometimes experimented all night, taking only brief naps while the chemicals were working, sometimes working and sleeping in his clothes for 72 hours at a stretch. James Adamson had been ushered into Eastman's office at 10:15 and had been warned that he must not take more than 5 minutes. But an hour had passed, and then 2 hours had passed, and they were still talking. Finally, George Eastman turned to Adamson and he said, "The last time I was in Japan, I bought some chairs, brought them home and put them in my sun's porch. But the sun peeled the paint, so I went downtown the other day and bought some paint and painted the chairs myself. Would you like to see what sort of job I can do painting chairs? All right, come to my home and have lunch with me, and I'll show you." After lunch, Mr. Eastman showed Adamson the chairs he bought from Japan. They weren't worth more than a few dollars, but George Eastman, now a multimillionaire, was proud of them because he himself had painted them. The order of the seats amounted to $90,000. Who do you suppose got the order, James Adamson or one of his competitors? From time to time of his story until Mr. Eastman's death, he and James Adamson were close friends. Claude Marais, a resident owner of Rouen, France, used this principle and saved his restaurant the floss of a key employee. This woman had been in his employ for 5 years and was a vital link between M. Marais and his staff of 21 people. He was shocked to receive a registered letter from her advising of her resignation. Miss M. Marais reported, I was very surprised and even more disappointed because I was under the impression that I had been fair to her and receptive in her needs. Inasmuch as she was a friend and as well as an employee, I probably had taken her too much for granted, and maybe she was even more demanding of other employees. I could not, of course, accept this resignation without some explanation. I took her aside and said, Paulette, you must understand that I cannot accept your resignation. You mean a great deal to me and to this company, and you are as important to the success of this restaurant as I am. I repeated this in front of the entire staff and invited her to my house and reiterated my confidence in her and with my family present. Paulette withdrew her resignation, and today I can rely on her as never before. I frequently reinforce this by expressing my appreciation for what she does and showing how important she is to me and to the restaurant. Talk to people about themselves, said Disraeli, one of the shrewdest men who ever ruled the British Empire. Talk to people about themselves and they will listen for hours. Principle 6. Make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. All right. That brings chapter 6 to part 2 to a conclusion. For discussion of principle 6, I'd have to agree again. We've gone through half the book now, and I have to agree with every point that Dale Carnegie has said. What's that saying? You attract more flies with honey than with vinegar? That is true. That is most certainly true. I don't know. What do you think? Comment down below. I know I keep looking at the screen when I should be looking at the camera. It's just, because I'm going from the book to the screen, I should be looking here. So if you've enjoyed my reading and you've had some questions or comments, please do so down below. This has been Dale Carnegie's How to Influence. This has been Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. International bestseller, 30 million people read worldwide. So far, everything I've read in this book has been, very to the point, very relevant even for today. And yeah, ta-ta for now. My hair's gone a bit mess, but that's okay. Ta-ta for now.